Have you ever wondered what it would be like to walk through the cobblestone streets of a medieval town at twilight, when the last rays of sunlight filter through narrow windows and the soft glow of candlelight begins to emerge from within? Tonight, we'll take a peaceful journey back in time, exploring the hidden stories and forgotten lives of the Middle Ages. From the quiet monasteries where monks copied ancient texts by flickering candlelight, to the bustling marketplaces where merchants traded goods from distant lands, we'll discover the human stories behind an era often shrouded in mystery. So settle back into your pillows, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow yourself to drift gently into the past, where kings and peasants, scholars and craftsmen, all lived their lives under the same star-filled sky that watches over us tonight. The dawn of the medieval world. As the Roman Empire slowly crumbled in the 5th century, like ancient stones gradually weathering away, a new world was quietly taking shape. The year 476 CE marked the traditional end of the Western Roman Empire, but this wasn't a sudden collapse. It was more like the gentle fading of daylight into dusk, a gradual transformation that unfolded over generations. In the silence left by Rome's retreat, new voices began to emerge. The Germanic tribes, the Goths, Vandals, Franks and Saxons weren't merely destroyers of civilization as once believed. They were skilled craftsmen, passionate storytellers, and complex societies with their own rich traditions. Archaeological discoveries have revealed intricate jewelry, sophisticated metalwork, and evidence of extensive trade networks that connected the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Picture, if you will, a Frankish chieftain in the 6th century, sitting by a fire in his wooden hall. The flames dance across elaborately carved pillars, illuminating tapestries that tell stories of heroic deeds and ancient gods. Around him, his warriors share mead from drinking horns decorated with silver, while a bard recites tales that have been passed down through generations. This was not the dark age of popular imagination, but a world rich with its own forms of beauty and meaning. The Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks from the 5th to 8th centuries, left behind some of the most exquisite artifacts of the early medieval period. Their burial sites, discovered by archaeologists, reveal a society that valued artistry and craftsmanship. Gold fibulae, elaborate brooches used to fasten clothing, were decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of both Germanic tradition and Roman influence. These weren't the creations of a primitive people, but the work of skilled artists who understood both beauty and symbolism. The monastery, islands of light in a changing world. As the old Roman administrative systems faded away, a new institution was quietly taking root across Europe, the monastery. These weren't merely places of prayer, but centers of learning, healing, and preservation that would safeguard the knowledge of the ancient world through the turbulent centuries ahead. Imagine walking through the gates of the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, founded by Saint Benedict around 529 CE. The morning mist still clings to the hillsides as you enter the peaceful courtyard. The only sounds are the gentle splash of water from the fountain and the soft murmur of monks beginning their daily prayers. Here, in this tranquil setting, scribes are carefully copying the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero, their quills moving steadily across parchment made from carefully prepared animal skins. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, established a pattern of life that would influence European culture for centuries. Ora et labora, pray and work, became the guiding principle. But this work wasn't limited to prayer and manual labor. The monasteries became repositories of knowledge, hospitals for the sick, schools for the young, and centers of agricultural innovation. In the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room, illuminated manuscripts were created with painstaking care. Picture a monk named Brother Thomas, working by the light of a small window, carefully painting the initial letter of a psalm. His pigments are made from ground lapis lazuli for the deep blue of the Virgin Mary's robes, gold leaf for the halos of saints, and vermilion from crushed cinnabar for the rich reds. Each page might take days to complete, with margin decorations that included fantastical creatures, intricate geometric patterns, and tiny scenes from daily life. The monastery gardens were marvels of practical knowledge. Monks cultivated not only the vegetables and grains needed for daily sustenance, but also extensive herb gardens for medicinal purposes. The Capitulare de Villis, a document from Charlemagne's court, lists over 70 plants that should be grown in monastery gardens. These included not only common herbs like sage and thyme, but also more exotic plants like anise and coriander, showing the extensive trade networks that connected even remote monasteries to the wider world. The Islamic Golden Age, a parallel renaissance. While Europe was experiencing its own transformation, the Islamic world was entering a period of extraordinary intellectual and cultural flowering. The rise of Islam in the 7th century had created a vast empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. And within this diverse realm, a remarkable synthesis of knowledge was taking place. In the great libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, scholars were translating and preserving the works of Greek philosophers, Indian mathematicians, and Persian poets. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 8th century, was perhaps the greatest center of learning in the medieval world. Here, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, translating texts from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. Picture the scholar Al-Kindi, known as the philosopher of the Arabs, working in his study in 9th century Baghdad. Surrounded by scrolls and codices, he's comparing different versions of Aristotle's works, making careful annotations in the margins. His task is not merely to translate, but to understand and synthesize the wisdom of different traditions. Through his work, and that of scholars like him, the philosophical heritage of ancient Greece was preserved and enhanced with new insights. The Islamic world also gave birth to remarkable innovations in science and technology. Al-Jazari, a 12th century inventor, created mechanical devices that were centuries ahead of their time, including programmable automata and sophisticated water clocks. His book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices describes machines that seem almost magical in their complexity. A tea-serving robot, a musical boat, and a castle clock that marked the hours with moving figures. In Islamic Spain, the cities of Cordoba and Toledo became centers of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe. The Library of Cordoba reportedly contained over 400,000 volumes at its peak, making it one of the largest libraries in the world. Christian scholars traveled there to study Arabic translations of Greek texts that had been lost in Western Europe, creating a bridge between the Islamic and Christian worlds. The Age of Charlemagne, the Carolingian Renaissance. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the ancient Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of a tall, imposing Frankish king named Charles. This moment marked the beginning of what would become known as the Carolingian Renaissance, a remarkable flowering of learning, art, and culture in early medieval Europe. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was more than a military conqueror. He was a patron of learning who understood that true power came not just from the sword, but from knowledge and culture. Though he himself could barely write, he surrounded himself with scholars and actively promoted education throughout his empire. Picture the royal court at Aachen, Charlemagne's capital, on a winter evening in 802. The great hall is lit by dozens of candles, their light reflecting off the polished marble columns that the king had imported from Rome and Ravenna. At the high table, Charlemagne sits not with warriors, but with scholars. Alcuin of York, his chief advisor on educational matters, Theodulf, the brilliant Spanish Goth who would become Bishop of Orleans, and Einhard, the diminutive scholar who would later write the emperor's biography. The conversation flows from Latin poetry to theological questions, from reports of new monasteries being founded to discussions of educational reform. Charlemagne has mandated that every monastery and cathedral should have a school, and that all clergy should be able to read and write. This might seem obvious to us today, but in the 8th century, it represented a revolutionary expansion of education. The Carolingian Renaissance produced some of the most beautiful manuscripts of the Middle Ages. The Gospel books created at the monastery of Saint-Denis, with their intricate ivory covers and gold lettering, were works of art that rivaled anything produced in the ancient world. The coronation Gospels, possibly used at Charlemagne's own coronation, demonstrate a level of artistic sophistication that challenges our assumptions about the Dark Ages. But perhaps the most lasting contribution of the Carolingian period was the development of a new script, Caroline minuscule. This clear, elegant handwriting made books easier to read and copy, and would eventually evolve into the lowercase letters we use today. In monastery scriptoriums across the empire, scribes were using this new script to create copies of classical texts, ensuring their survival for future generations. The hidden lives of medieval women. In the shadows of medieval history, often overlooked by chroniclers who focused on the deeds of kings and knights, lived remarkable women who shaped their world in profound ways. Their stories, pieced together from letters, wills, and archaeological evidence, reveal a more complex picture of a medieval society than we might imagine. Consider Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German Benedictine abbess, who was arguably one of the most accomplished individuals of her age. In her monastery on the Rhine, she composed music that still moves listeners today, wrote treatises on medicine and natural history, and corresponded with popes and emperors. Her visions, recorded in illuminated manuscripts, show a cosmos alive with divine energy, where plants, animals, and humans are all part of an interconnected web of creation. Hildegard's musical compositions, preserved in manuscripts like the Dendermonde Codex, reveal a sophisticated understanding of melody and harmony. Her Ordo Virtutum, the play of virtues, is one of the earliest known musical dramas, featuring personified virtues engaged in a cosmic battle against evil. When performed in the candlelit chapel of her monastery, with the nuns' voices echoing off stone walls, it must have created an otherworldly atmosphere that transported listeners to the very threshold of heaven. In medieval England, we find another remarkable woman, Julian of Norwich, the first known female writer in English. Living as an anchoress, a religious hermit walled into a small cell attached to a church, she experienced a series of visions that she recorded in her Revelations of Divine Love. Her theology was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing God's love rather than wrath, and famously describing God as mother as well as father. The daily life of medieval women varied greatly depending on their social class and circumstances. Archaeological evidence from medieval London shows that women were active in many trades, as brewers, bakers, silk workers, and even as merchants in their own right. The widow of a craftsman might inherit his workshop and continue his trade, sometimes achieving considerable prosperity and influence. In the countryside, peasant women worked alongside their husbands in the fields, but they also had specialized roles. They were responsible for the care of small animals, chickens, geese, and pigs, and for the production of dairy products. They gathered herbs for cooking and medicine, spun thread, and wove cloth. Their knowledge of plants and healing was so extensive that they were sometimes suspected of witchcraft, though most were simply skilled practitioners of traditional medicine. the craft guilds, masters of medieval industry. In the growing towns and cities of medieval Europe, a new social institution was emerging that would transform commerce and craftsmanship: the guild system. These associations of artisans and merchants created a complex web of regulations, traditions, and mutual support that governed medieval economic life. Picture the workshop of Master Heinrich, a goldsmith in 13th century Cologne. The morning light streams through small windows, illuminating workbenches where apprentices are learning the intricate art of metalworking. The air is filled with the scent of beeswax and the sound of hammers on metal. Heinrich is working on a reliquary, an ornate container for sacred relics, commissioned by the local cathedral. The piece requires not only technical skill, but also deep religious knowledge, as every symbol and decoration must be theologically appropriate. The guild system created a structured path from apprentice to journeyman to master. An apprentice, typically a boy of 12 or 14, would live in his master's household for 7 years, learning not only the technical skills of the trade, but also its customs and values. He would begin with the simplest tasks: sweeping the workshop, maintaining the fire, preparing materials, gradually working his way up to more complex work. After completing his apprenticeship, he would become a journeyman, free to travel and work for different masters. This period of travel was crucial for spreading techniques and ideas across Europe. A young carpenter might work in Paris, learning the latest methods of cathedral construction, then travel to England to help build a new abbey, carrying his knowledge with him. To become a master, the journeyman had to create a masterpiece, a work that demonstrated his complete mastery of the craft. This might be an elaborate piece of furniture, a set of tools, or a work of art, depending on the trade. The guild would examine the work carefully, and only if it met their exacting standards would the craftsman be admitted to the ranks of masters. The guilds also served as social organizations, providing care for sick members, support for widows and orphans, and organizing religious festivals. Each guild had its own patron saint and would participate in religious processions, carrying elaborate banners and wearing distinctive livery. The guild halls, with their carved facades and painted interiors, were symbols of civic pride and prosperity. The merchant adventures, trade routes, and cultural exchange. Medieval Europe was far from isolated. A vast network of trade routes connected the continent to the rest of the world, carrying not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. These routes created a truly global economy, centuries before the term globalization was invented. The most famous of these routes was the Silk Road, which connected Europe to China through a series of overland paths across Central Asia. But equally important were the maritime routes that linked the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and the river routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. Picture a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, not the famous explorer but perhaps his contemporary, preparing for a trading expedition to Constantinople in the 13th century. His ship, a sturdy galley with both sails and oars, is being loaded with goods from across Europe: fine woolen cloth from Flanders, amber from the Baltic, wine from France, and metalwork from Germany. In return, he hopes to bring back spices from India, silk from China, and precious stones from Ceylon. The journey would take him through the heart of the Byzantine Empire, where East and West met in a dazzling display of cultural fusion. Constantinople was a city where Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon, guarded the harbour, where the Hagia Sophia's massive dome seemed to float impossibly in the air, and where merchants from Russia, Italy, and the Middle East rubbed shoulders in the great bazaars. But trade routes weren't just about luxury goods. They also carried everyday items that transformed daily life. Paper, invented in China, and brought to Europe via the Islamic world, revolutionized record-keeping and learning. The windmill, probably invented in Persia, was adapted for European conditions and transformed agriculture. The compass, another Chinese invention, made navigation safer and more accurate. These trade networks also carried diseases, most notably the Black Death, which swept across Europe in the 14th century. But they also carried knowledge, artistic styles, and cultural practices. The pointed arch, a key feature of Gothic architecture, may have been inspired by Islamic architectural forms encountered during the Crusades. The use of zero in mathematics, essential for advanced calculations, came to Europe from India via the Islamic world. The merchant families who organized this trade often became immensely wealthy and influential. The Medici family of Florence, who started as wool merchants, eventually became bankers to kings and popes. Their wealth allowed them to become patrons of art and learning, supporting artists like Michelangelo and scholars like Marsilio Ficino. The rise of universities, centers of learning. In the 11th and 12th centuries, a new institution was emerging in medieval Europe that would fundamentally change the nature of education and intellectual life. The university. These were not merely schools, but communities of scholars dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms. The first universities grew out of cathedral schools, where young men trained for careers in the church. But as the demand for educated administrators, lawyers, and doctors grew, these schools expanded their curriculum and attracted students from across Europe. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, specialized in law. The University of Paris, established around 1150, became famous for theology and philosophy. The University of Oxford, founded in the 12th century, was known for its comprehensive curriculum. Picture a young scholar named Thomas arriving at the University of Paris in 1250. He has travelled from England, carrying his few possessions in a leather satchel. The city is bustling with activity, and he can hear a dozen different languages spoken in the streets. Students from all over Europe have come here to study, creating a truly international community of learning. Thomas's daily routine would be rigorous. He would rise before dawn for morning prayers, then attend lectures that began at first light. The lectures were given in Latin, the international language of scholarship, and followed a strict format. The master would read from a text, perhaps Aristotle's Ethics or the Bible, and then provide commentary and explanation. Students would take notes on wax tablets, later copying important passages onto parchment. The curriculum was based on the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric and logic, the trivium, and arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the quadrivium. These subjects were considered essential for any educated person, providing the foundation for more advanced study in theology, law, or medicine. The university was organized into nations, associations of students from the same region. The English nation included students from England and Ireland. The French nation included those from France and Southern Europe, and so on. These nations provided mutual support and protection, and also participated in university governance. Student life was not always focused on study. Medieval universities were notorious for their rowdy atmosphere, with frequent disputes between students and townspeople. Students were technically members of the clergy, which gave them certain legal privileges, but also created resentment among the local population. Riots and street fights were not uncommon, and universities sometimes had to suspend classes and threaten to relocate to other cities to restore order. But despite these disruptions, the universities produced remarkable scholars. Thomas Aquinas, studying at Paris in the 13th century, created a synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy that would influence Western thought for centuries. Roger Bacon, working at Oxford, conducted experiments that helped lay the foundation for modern science. These scholars were not isolated academics, but active participants in the intellectual life of their time, corresponding with rulers and church leaders, and influencing policy and doctrine. The age of the Crusades: faith, conflict, and cultural exchange. In the year 1095, in a field outside the French city of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd of nobles, knights, and common people. His words would echo across centuries, launching a series of military expeditions that would reshape the relationship between East and West, Christian and Muslim, for generations to come. "God wills it!" the crowd reportedly shouted in response to Urban's call for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem. But the reality of the Crusades was far more complex than this dramatic moment suggests. These weren't simply wars between Christianity and Islam, but a series of conflicts that involved political ambition, economic opportunity, and genuine religious fervor in equal measure. Picture a young knight named Geoffrey, perhaps the third son of a minor noble family in France, as he prepares to take the cross in 1096. His motivation is mixed, partly religious devotion, partly the promise of adventure, and partly the practical consideration that as a younger son, he has little inheritance to look forward to at home. He sews a red cross onto his surcoat, the symbol that will identify him as a crusader, and begins the long journey to Constantinople. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, was a chaotic affair. Several armies, led by nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, made their way through Europe to Constantinople, where they were supposed to rendezvous with the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I. But the emperor was alarmed by the size and unruliness of the crusading forces, and tensions quickly developed between the Western Crusaders and their Eastern Christian allies. The Crusaders' journey through Anatolia was marked by terrible hardships. They faced extreme heat, lack of water, and constant attacks from Seljuk Turkish forces. Many died not in glorious battle, but from disease, exhaustion, and thirst. Yet somehow, against all odds, they managed to capture Antioch in 1098 and Jerusalem in 1099. The capture of Jerusalem was a moment of triumph for the Crusaders, but it was also marked by terrible violence. Contemporary accounts describe indiscriminate slaughter of Muslims and Jews, actions that would poison relationships between different religious communities for centuries to come. Yet within a generation, the Crusader states had developed a more complex relationship with their Muslim neighbors, involving trade, diplomacy, and even occasional military cooperation. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli became fascinating experiments in cross-cultural interaction. Frankish knights married into local Christian families, adopted Eastern customs, and learned to appreciate the sophisticated culture of the Islamic world. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights established networks of fortifications and financial institutions that spanned Europe and the Holy Land. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Crusades was the cultural exchange they facilitated. Crusaders returning to Europe brought with them new ideas about mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. They had tasted sugar for the first time, learned about new agricultural techniques, and encountered architectural styles that would influence European building for centuries to come. The great Muslim leader Saladin, who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, was remembered in European sources not as a monster, but as a chivalrous opponent who embodied the best qualities of knighthood. His respect for his Christian enemies, his mercy toward prisoners, and his personal piety made him a figure of admiration even among his enemies. The Soaring Stone, Gothic cathedrals, and medieval architecture. In the 12th century, a revolutionary new style of architecture began to emerge in the Île-de-France region around Paris. This style, which we now call Gothic, represented not just a new way of building, but a new way of thinking about space, light, and the relationship between earth and heaven. The first Gothic cathedral was the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, rebuilt by Abbot Suger between 1140 and 1144. Suger had a vision of a church that would be filled with light, where the walls themselves would seem to disappear in a blaze of coloured glass. To achieve this vision, he and his master masons developed new techniques that would revolutionize architecture. Picture yourself standing in the nave of Chartres Cathedral on a bright morning in 1220. The sun streams through the famous blue windows, casting patterns of coloured light across the stone floor. Above you, the vaulted ceiling soars 120 feet into the air, supported by flying buttresses that seem to defy gravity. The walls are almost entirely composed of glass, held in place by delicate stone tracery that resembles lacework carved in stone. The technical innovations that made Gothic architecture possible were remarkable. The pointed arch, adapted from Islamic architecture, could bear more weight than the rounded arches of Romanesque buildings. The ribbed vault distributed weight more efficiently, allowing for thinner walls and larger windows. The flying buttress, perhaps the most distinctive feature of Gothic architecture, transferred the weight of the roof to external supports, freeing the walls to become screens of glass. But Gothic cathedrals were more than just technical achievements. They were total works of art, where architecture, sculpture, painting, and craftsmanship combined to create a unified vision of the divine. The portals of Gothic cathedrals were adorned with thousands of sculptures depicting biblical scenes, the lives of saints, and the Last Judgment. These were not mere decorations, but teaching tools, designed to instruct a largely illiterate population in the stories and doctrines of Christianity. The stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals were perhaps their most glorious feature. The deep blues of Chartres, the jewel-like colours of Sainte-Chapelle, the narrative cycles of Canterbury. These windows transformed natural light into something mystical and transcendent. The glass painters of the medieval period developed techniques for creating colours that have never been equalled, using recipes that were closely guarded trade secrets. The construction of a Gothic cathedral was a community effort that could span generations. The Cathedral of Cologne, begun in 1248, was not completed until 1880. Entire families of masons might work on a single building, passing their skills from father to son. The master mason was both architect and sculptor, responsible for the overall design and the training of apprentices. The cathedral building sites were bustling centres of activity. Stone was quarried from nearby hillsides and transported by ox cart to the construction site. Skilled carvers worked on capitals and sculpture, while glaziers created the stained glass windows in workshops near the cathedral. The sound of chisels on stone, the creak of wooden scaffolding, and the shouts of workers created a symphony of construction that could be heard throughout the town. The art of illumination, medieval manuscripts and their creators, in the quiet scriptoriums of medieval monasteries and the bustling workshops of urban book producers, one of the most refined art forms of the Middle Ages was being perfected: the illuminated manuscript. These were not merely books, but precious objects that combine text, image, and decoration in ways that modern printing can barely approximate. The creation of an illuminated manuscript was a complex process that required the skills of many different craftsmen. The parchment maker prepared the animal skins, treating them with lime and scraping them smooth. The scribe copied the text in careful scripts, leaving spaces for decoration. The illuminator added the painted elements, initial letters, border decorations, and miniature paintings. The binder assembled the finished pages and created protective covers, often decorated with precious metals and jewels. Picture the workshop of Master Jean Pucelle in 14th century Paris, one of the most famous illuminators of his time. The room is filled with natural light from large windows, essential for the delicate work of painting. On wooden tables, several books are in various stages of completion. One scribe is carefully copying text in Gothic script, while another is adding gold leaf to the initial letters. Pucelle himself is working on a book of hours commissioned by the Queen of France, painting tiny figures with brushes made from individual hairs. The pigments used in medieval illumination were often more valuable than gold. Ultramarine blue, made from ground lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, was so expensive that it was reserved for the most important figures, usually the Virgin Mary. Vermilion red came from cinnabar, while a rich purple was made from murex shells. Gold leaf was applied over a base of gesso, creating a lustrous surface that would catch and reflect light. The most popular type of illuminated manuscript was the Book of Hours, a prayer book designed for private devotion. These books contained prayers for each hour of the day, as well as calendar pages showing the activities appropriate to each month. The Très Riche Heures du Duc de Berry, created by the Limbourg brothers in the early 15th century, is perhaps the most famous example. Its calendar pages show an idealized vision of medieval life, with peasants working in the fields under the watchful eye of magnificent castles. But illuminated manuscripts weren't limited to religious texts. Medieval romance literature, historical chronicles, and even scientific treatises were given lavish illustration. The Romance of the Rose, a 13th century French poem about courtly love, was illustrated with scenes of knights and ladies in elaborate gardens. The Très Riche Heures includes not only religious material, but also astrological charts and maps of the known world. The marginalia, decorative elements in the margins of manuscripts, often provide the most vivid glimpses into medieval life and imagination. These might include fantastic creatures, humorous scenes, or detailed depictions of everyday objects. A manuscript might have a serious religious text in the center of the page, surrounded by margins filled with playful rabbits, grotesque faces, or elaborate vine scrolls. The rise of vernacular literature, stories in the common tongue. For centuries, serious literature in medieval Europe was written in Latin, the language of learning and the church. But beginning in the 12th century, authors began to write in the vernacular languages, the tongues actually spoken by the people. This shift marked a democratization of literature and the birth of national literary traditions. The earliest vernacular literature often dealt with themes of love and adventure. The chansons de geste, songs of heroic deeds, celebrated the exploits of Charlemagne and his knights. The Song of Roland, probably composed in the 11th century, tells the story of a heroic last stand at the Battle of Roncesvalles, transforming a historical defeat into a tale of Christian heroism and sacrifice. But it was the literature of courtly love that truly revolutionized medieval poetry. The troubadours of southern France, writing in Occitan, created a new form of lyric poetry that celebrated refined love, often between a knight and a noble lady. This literature was performed in the courts of nobles, accompanied by music, and sometimes by elaborate dramatic presentations. Picture the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century, one of the most sophisticated cultural centers of medieval Europe. The Great Hall is filled with nobles, dressed in their finest clothes, the walls hung with tapestries depicting scenes of romance and adventure. A troubadour named Bernard de Ventadorn steps forward to sing a new composition, his voice accompanied by a viol and a lute. His song tells of a knight's hopeless love for a married lady, expressing emotions with a subtlety and psychological insight that would influence European poetry for centuries. The Arthurian romances, which began to appear in the 12th century, created a mythical world that captured the medieval imagination. Chrétien de Troyes, writing in French, created the first literary versions of Lancelot, Percival, and the quest for the Holy Grail.
These stories combined Celtic mythology with Christian symbolism, creating a rich tapestry of meaning that could be read on multiple levels. Perhaps the greatest literary achievement of the Middle Ages was Dante's Divine Comedy, completed in the early 14th century. Written in Italian rather than Latin, it tells the story of Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, guided first by the Roman poet Virgil and then by his beloved Beatrice. The poem is at once a personal confession, a political satire, and a theological treatise, demonstrating the full potential of vernacular literature. The rise of vernacular literature was closely connected to the growth of towns and the emergence of a literate merchant class. Urban audiences wanted stories that reflected their own experiences and concerns, not just the aristocratic world of knightly romance. Fabliaux, short, often humorous tales, depicted the lives of merchants, craftsmen, and peasants with a realism that was new in medieval literature. The Jewish communities, scholars, merchants, and mystics. Throughout medieval Europe, Jewish communities maintained their own rich intellectual and cultural traditions while navigating the complex relationships with their Christian neighbors. Far from being isolated, these communities were integral to medieval society, contributing to commerce, scholarship, and cultural exchange in ways that are often overlooked in traditional histories. The Jewish communities of medieval Europe were remarkably diverse, stretching from the Sephardic Jews of Spain and southern France to the Ashkenazi communities of Germany and Eastern Europe. Each developed its own customs, traditions, and intellectual approaches, while maintaining connections to the broader Jewish world through trade, correspondence, and scholarly exchange. Picture the Jewish quarter of 12th century Cordoba, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked together in an atmosphere of remarkable intellectual tolerance. The great philosopher, Moses Maimonides, known in Hebrew as the Rambam, is working on his masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, attempting to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish theology. His work, written in Arabic but quickly translated into Hebrew and Latin, would influence not only Jewish thought, but also Christian philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. Jewish communities were often at the center of medieval commerce. Jewish merchants traveled the trade routes between Europe and the East, their networks of family and religious connections providing the trust and credit necessary for long-distance trade. The Radhanites, Jewish merchants of the 9th and 10th centuries, maintained trade routes that stretched from Western Europe to China, carrying goods and ideas across vast distances. The study of Jewish law and literature flourished in medieval Europe. The great centers of Jewish learning, Cordoba, Toledo, Paris, and the Rhineland cities, produced scholars whose works are still studied today. Rashi, the 11th century French commentator, created explanations of the Bible and Talmud that became standard texts in Jewish education. His clear, precise style made complex legal and theological concepts accessible to students throughout Europe. The Jewish communities also developed rich traditions of mystical thought. The Kabbalah, which emerged in 12th century southern France and Spain, sought to understand the hidden meanings of Scripture and the nature of divine reality. The Zohar, a 13th century mystical text, described a complex system of divine emanations and spiritual worlds that would influence Jewish thought for centuries. But Jewish life in medieval Europe was also marked by persecution and uncertainty. The First Crusade in 1096 was accompanied by massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland. The ritual murder libel, the false accusation that Jews killed Christian children for religious purposes, led to violence and expulsions. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated that Jews wear distinctive clothing, marking them as outsiders in Christian society. Despite these challenges, Jewish communities continued to contribute to medieval culture in significant ways. Jewish physicians, trained in the medical traditions of the Islamic world,
served Christian as well as Jewish patients. Jewish scholars translated philosophical and scientific works from Arabic into Latin, helping to transmit the knowledge of the ancient world to medieval Europe. Jewish artisans created illuminated manuscripts, ceremonial objects, and architectural elements that enriched medieval visual culture. The medieval economy, agriculture, trade, and innovation. Beneath the surface of medieval politics and warfare, a complex economic system was developing that would lay the foundations for the modern European economy. This system was based on agriculture, but it also included sophisticated networks of trade, manufacturing, and finance that connected local communities to international markets. The agricultural revolution of the Middle Ages was built on several key innovations. The heavy plough, which could turn the thick soils of northern Europe, made it possible to farm previously unusable land. The three-field system, which rotated crops to maintain soil fertility, increased agricultural productivity. The horse collar, which allowed horses to pull heavier loads than oxen, revolutionized transportation and farming. Picture a medieval manor in 13th century England during the height of the harvest season. The great open fields stretched to the horizon, divided into strips worked by individual peasant families. The sound of scythes cutting through grain mingles with the lowing of cattle and the calls of workers. In the distance, a windmill turns slowly, grinding grain into flour that will feed the community through the winter. The manor was the basic unit of medieval agricultural organization. The lord of the manor provided land, protection, and justice, while the peasants provided labor and a share of their crops. This system, known as feudalism, created a complex web of mutual obligations that bound together all levels of medieval society. But medieval agriculture was more innovative than often supposed. Monks at monasteries like Cluny and Citeaux pioneered new techniques of land reclamation, turning marshes and forests into productive farmland. They developed new varieties of crops, improved breeds of livestock, and created sophisticated systems of water management. The Cistercian monasteries in particular were known for their technical innovations, including the use of water power for various industrial processes. The growth of towns and cities in the later Middle Ages created new markets for agricultural products and stimulated trade. The great commercial centres, Venice, Genoa, the Hanseatic League cities, and the Flemish towns, developed sophisticated financial instruments that made long-distance trade possible. Letters of credit, insurance, and double-entry bookkeeping were medieval innovations that are still used today. The medieval economy was also characterized by remarkable specialization. The English wool trade, the Flemish cloth industry, and the German silver mines created regional specializations that were connected by extensive trade networks. The Champagne fairs, held 6 times a year in different towns in northeastern France, brought together merchants from across Europe to exchange goods and settle accounts. The Black Death, a world transformed. In the autumn of 1347, a Genoese trading ship limped into the harbour of Messina in Sicily. The crew was dying or dead, their bodies covered with black swellings and fever. They had brought with them more than just goods from the East. They had brought the most devastating pandemic in human history, the Black Death. The plague spread with terrifying speed across Europe, following the trade routes that connected the continent. Within 3 years, it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. But the Black Death was more than just a demographic catastrophe. It was a cultural and social revolution that transformed medieval society in profound ways. Picture a small town in France in 1348, during the height of the plague. The streets, usually bustling with activity, are eerily quiet. Houses stand empty, their doors marked with crosses to indicate that the inhabitants have died.
The parish church, where the community gathered for celebration and mourning, is overwhelmed with bodies. The priest, one of the few survivors, struggles to perform the burial rites for dozens of victims each day. The immediate impact of the plague was devastating. Entire communities were wiped out, monasteries abandoned, and fields left untended. The careful social structures that had developed over centuries collapsed almost overnight, but the long-term effects were more complex and in some ways positive. The massive population decline created a labor shortage that fundamentally changed the relationship between lords and peasants. Serfs, who had been bound to the land for generations, could now demand better conditions or simply leave to find work elsewhere. Wages rose dramatically, and the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism began to break down. The plague also had profound cultural and psychological effects. The constant presence of death created a new sensibility that emphasized the fragility of life and the importance of living in the present. This can be seen in the art of the period, which often featured macabre themes like the Dance of Death, where skeletons lead representatives of all social classes in a final dance. The Black Death also sparked a crisis of faith. Many people questioned how a loving God could allow such suffering. Some turned to extreme religious practices, like the flagellant movements that swept across Europe. Others blamed minority groups, particularly Jews, leading to terrible pogroms that decimated Jewish communities. But the plague also accelerated certain positive developments. The need to replace the clergy who had died led to reforms in clerical education. The labor shortage encouraged technological innovation as employers sought ways to increase productivity with fewer workers. The social mobility created by the plague helped to break down old barriers and create new opportunities. The twilight of the Middle Ages, transformation and renewal. As the 14th and 15th centuries progressed, medieval Europe was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The old certainties of feudalism, the universal church, and the hierarchical society were giving way to new forms of organization, new ways of thinking, and new approaches to art and culture. The Great Schism of 1378 to 1417, when rival popes ruled simultaneously in Rome and Avignon, shattered the unity of the medieval church. The 100 Years' War between England and France created new forms of national identity and military organization. The rise of powerful monarchies in France, England, and Spain centralized political power and reduced the independence of the nobility. Picture the court of Burgundy in the 15th century, one of the most sophisticated cultural centers of late medieval Europe. Duke Philip the Good has gathered artists, musicians, and scholars from across Europe to create a court culture that rivals that of any Renaissance prince. The walls of the ducal palace are hung with tapestries depicting scenes from classical mythology and chivalric romance. Musicians perform complex polyphonic compositions, while court painters create portraits of unprecedented realism and psychological depth. The late Middle Ages saw remarkable achievements in technology and exploration. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized the spread of knowledge. Books, which had been rare and expensive, became increasingly common. The compass, improved sailing techniques, and new ship designs made possible the voyages of exploration that would connect Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way people thought about themselves and their world. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century, represented a new confidence in human potential and a renewed interest in the classical world. Humanist scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio began to study ancient texts, not just as sources of authority, but as works of art and human achievement. The medieval world was not ending with a bang, but with a gradual transformation. The institutions, ideas, and cultural achievements of the Middle Ages would continue to influence European society for centuries to come. The universities founded in the medieval period continued to be centers of learning. The legal systems developed in the Middle Ages formed the basis for modern European law. The architectural achievements of the Gothic period continued to inspire builders and architects. The pilgrimage roads, spiritual journeys across medieval Europe. In the gentle mists of a dawn in 12th century France, imagine a small group of pilgrims gathering at the steps of a village church. They carry simple wooden staffs, wear broad-brimmed hats to shield them from sun and rain, and bear on their cloaks the scallop shell, the symbol of pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Their journey will take them across hundreds of miles of medieval Europe, following ancient paths that have been trodden by countless feet, seeking spiritual renewal and divine grace. The pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe were like arteries of faith, carrying streams of humanity across the continent. The most famous was the Camino de Santiago, leading to the shrine of St. James in northwestern Spain. But pilgrims also travelled to Rome to visit the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul, to Canterbury to honour the martyred Thomas Becket, and to countless smaller shrines scattered across the landscape. Picture Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrims gathered at the Tabard Inn in Southwark before setting out for Canterbury. The wife of Bath adjusts her bright red stockings and large hat, while the knight checks his horse's harness one final time. The miller, already slightly drunk, tells a ribald story that makes the prioress blush behind her wimple. These travellers represent all levels of medieval society, nobles and peasants, clergy and merchants, scholars and craftsmen, united in their shared journey toward a sacred destination. The pilgrimage roads were lined with hospices, monasteries, and inns that provided shelter and sustenance for travellers. The Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, founded in the 11th century, established a network of hostels across Europe. At these way stations, pilgrims could rest their weary feet, share meals with fellow travellers, and hear tales of distant lands and miraculous healings. The economic impact of pilgrimage was enormous. Entire towns grew up around major shrines, their prosperity dependent on the steady stream of visitors. Local craftsmen produced pilgrim badges, reliquaries, and religious souvenirs. Merchants set up stalls along the routes, selling everything from food and wine to shoes and rosary beads. The Great Fair of Compostela, held during the Saints' Feast Day, attracted merchants from across Europe. But pilgrimage was more than just commerce. It was a profound spiritual experience that transformed both individuals and communities. The physical hardships of the journey, the long days of walking, the simple food, the nights spent in unfamiliar places, were seen as forms of penance that purified the soul. Many pilgrims reported mystical experiences along the way, visions of saints, miraculous healings, or moments of profound spiritual insight. The pilgrimage routes also served as conduits for cultural exchange. Pilgrims from different regions shared stories, songs, and traditions. Architectural styles spread along the routes as churches and hostels were built to accommodate the growing numbers of travelers. The Romanesque churches of the Camino de Santiago, with their distinctive sculptural programs, created a unified artistic vocabulary that stretched across Europe. The medieval kitchen, flavors of the past. The medieval kitchen was a world unto itself, filled with the aromas of herbs and spices, the sounds of chopping and stirring, and the warm glow of hearth fires. Food in the Middle Ages was far more varied and sophisticated than modern stereotypes suggest, reflecting complex trade networks, agricultural innovations, and culinary traditions that had been passed down through generations. Imagine entering the kitchen of a prosperous merchant's house in 14th century London. The large central hearth dominates the room, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Copper pots hang from iron hooks, while wooden bowls and plates line the shelves. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat, freshly baked bread, and the exotic spices that have travelled thousands of miles from the markets of Constantinople and Venice. The medieval diet varied greatly depending on social class and geographic location. Peasants typically ate dark bread, porridge, vegetables from their gardens, and occasional meat from their chickens or pigs. But even this simple fare was enhanced with herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme, grown in every cottage garden. During harvest time, the tables of even the poorest families might groan under the weight of fresh fruits, vegetables, and grain. The wealthy enjoyed a much more elaborate cuisine. Medieval cookbooks, like the 14th century English Form of Cury, reveal a sophisticated understanding of flavor combinations and cooking techniques. Dishes might include roasted peacock served with its feathers restored, elaborate meat pies shaped like castles, and sweet confections made with honey, almonds, and imported spices. Spices were the luxury items of the medieval kitchen. Black pepper, brought from India at enormous cost, was sometimes used as currency. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were worth their weight in silver. These spices were used not just for flavor, but also for their supposed medicinal properties. Medieval medical theory held that the body needed to maintain a balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors, and spices were used to correct imbalances. The preparation of food was a skilled craft. Professional cooks served apprenticeships just like other artisans, learning the complex techniques needed to create elaborate dishes. They knew how to clarify broths, create delicate sauces, and present food in visually stunning ways. The art of food preservation was equally important. Meat was salted, smoked, or pickled to last through the winter months. Medieval feasts were elaborate theatrical performances where food was just one element of a larger spectacle. The Christmas feast at a noble court might feature dozens of courses, each presented with great ceremony. Servants would carry in dishes accompanied by musicians, and the food itself might be arranged to tell stories or represent heraldic symbols. The famous subtlety, elaborate sugar sculptures that depicted castles, ships, or mythological scenes, served as entertainment between courses. The rituals surrounding food were deeply ingrained in medieval culture. The sharing of bread was a sacred act, and the host's duty to provide hospitality was taken seriously. Even the seating arrangement at meals reflected social hierarchies, with the most honored guests placed closest to the salt cellar. The act of eating together created bonds of community and mutual obligation that extended far beyond the dining hall. The medieval physician, healing arts and medical practice. In a dimly lit chamber in 13th century Salerno, the most famous medical school in Europe, a young student named Andreas carefully examines a patient. The walls are lined with shelves containing glass vials filled with herbs, minerals, and mysterious compounds. Ancient texts by Hippocrates, Galen, and the great Islamic physician Ibn Sina lie open on a wooden lectern, their pages illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps. Medieval medicine was a complex blend of ancient wisdom, Islamic scholarship, Christian theology, and practical experience. The physicians of the Middle Ages were not the primitive healers of popular imagination, but learned scholars who had studied for years at universities and medical schools. They understood anatomy, prescribed sophisticated treatments, and performed surgical procedures with remarkable skill. The medical curriculum at universities like Salerno, Montpellier, and Paris was rigorous and comprehensive. Students studied the works of classical authors like Galen and Avicenna, learning about the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that were believed to govern health and disease. They learned to diagnose illness by examining urine, taking the pulse, and observing the patient's complexion and behaviour. Medieval physicians had an impressive pharmacopoeia at their disposal. Monastery gardens grew dozens of medicinal plants, from common herbs like chamomile and mint to more exotic substances like mandrake and hellebore. The great medical texts of the period, like the Circa Instans of Matthias Platearius, described hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral remedies. Willow bark was used for pain relief. It contained salicin, the precursor to aspirin, while digitalis from foxglove was prescribed for heart conditions. Surgery, though dangerous without modern anesthesia and antiseptics, was practiced with considerable skill. The chirurgia of Henri de Mondeville, a 14th century French surgeon, describes procedures for treating wounds, setting bones, and removing tumours. Medieval surgeons understood the importance of cleanliness and developed techniques for controlling bleeding. They performed cataract surgery, removed kidney stones, and even attempted brain surgery. The hospital system of medieval Europe was largely a creation of the Church, but it served all members of society, regardless of their religious affiliation. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century, could accommodate hundreds of patients. These hospitals provided not just medical care, but also food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. The nursing care was provided by religious orders, particularly women's communities, that developed sophisticated understanding of patient care. Medieval physicians also understood the importance of mental health. The concept of melancholia, what we might now call depression, was recognized and treated with a combination of dietary changes, exercise, music, and counseling. The physicians of the Islamic world, whose works were translated into Latin, had developed particularly sophisticated approaches to mental illness. The practice of medicine was closely regulated by guilds and university degrees. In many cities, unlicensed healers were forbidden to practice, though in reality, much medical care was provided by herbalists, midwives, and folk healers who had learned their skills through oral tradition. These practitioners often had extensive knowledge of local plants and traditional remedies that had been passed down through generations. The art of war, knights, castles, and medieval warfare. The morning mist clings to the battlements of a great castle in 12th century France. In the courtyard below, young squires practice their swordplay under the watchful eye of their master, a grizzled knight who has survived countless battles. The ring of steel on steel echoes off the stone walls, while somewhere in the distance, a horn calls the garrison to morning prayers. Medieval warfare was far more complex and sophisticated than the popular image of knights charging blindly into battle. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of strategy, technology, and psychology that required years of training and vast resources. The knight was not just a warrior, but a military professional who had mastered the arts of combat, leadership, and siege warfare. The education of a knight began in childhood. At age 7, a boy of noble birth would be sent to another noble household to serve as a page. He would learn to read and write, study music and poetry, and begin his physical training. At 14, he would become a squire, serving a knight and learning the practical skills of warfare. He would care for his master's weapons and armor, help him dress for battle, and accompany him on campaigns. The ceremony of knighthood was a deeply religious ritual that took place in a church or chapel. The candidate would spend the night in prayer and fasting, then be blessed by a priest and invested with his sword, spurs, and other symbols of knighthood. The oath he took bound him not just to military service, but to a code of conduct that emphasized honor, courtesy, and protection of the weak. The knight's equipment was a masterpiece of medieval technology. A suit of mail armor might contain 50,000 individual rings, each one carefully crafted and linked by hand. The great helm, with its narrow eye slits and breathing holes, provided protection while allowing limited vision. The knight's sword was not just a weapon, but a work of art with elaborate crossguards, pommels, and blade decorations that reflected his status and wealth. The medieval castle was both a residence and a fortress, designed to withstand siege and provide a base for military operations. The great stone keeps of the 12th and 13th centuries were marvels of engineering, with walls up to 20 feet thick and towers that soared above the surrounding countryside. The concentric castles of Edward I's conquest of Wales represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture, with multiple lines of defense and sophisticated gate systems. Siege warfare was a specialized art that required engineers, craftsmen, and skilled operators. The great siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, and battering rams were complex machines that could hurl massive stones or fire over castle walls. The art of undermining, where attackers dug tunnels beneath castle walls and then collapsed them with fires, required careful planning and skilled miners. But medieval warfare was not just about individual combat or siege operations. It involved complex logistics, intelligence gathering, and diplomatic maneuvering. A successful campaign required the coordination of supplies, the recruitment of soldiers, and the negotiation of alliances. The great military leaders of the period, like William Marshall or Edward the Black Prince, were as skilled in administration and diplomacy as they were in combat. The laws of war in medieval Europe were surprisingly sophisticated. The concept of chivalry provided rules for the treatment of prisoners, the protection of non-combatants, and the conduct of warfare. These rules were not always followed, but they represented an attempt to limit the brutality of war and maintain honor even in the midst of conflict. The Merchant's Tale: Commerce and Urban Life. In the bustling marketplace of 14th century Bruges, one of the greatest commercial centers of medieval Europe, the air is filled with the sounds of commerce. Merchants from England hawk their fine wool, while Italian bankers negotiate letters of credit that will finance trade across the continent. The smell of spices mingles with the scent of fresh bread from the bakers' stalls, and the colourful cloth from Flemish weavers creates a rainbow of hues in the morning light. The rise of medieval towns and cities was one of the most significant developments of the later Middle Ages. These urban centres became engines of economic growth, technological innovation, and cultural change that would reshape European society. The merchants who inhabited these cities were not just traders, but entrepreneurs who created new forms of business organization and financial instruments. Picture the counting house of Jacques Coeur, the famous 15th century French merchant who built a commercial empire stretching from France to the Levant. The room is lined with ledgers recording transactions in dozens of currencies, maps showing trade routes across Europe and the Mediterranean, and samples of goods from around the known world. Coeur's agents in Constantinople, Alexandria, and Damascus send regular reports on market conditions, political developments, and new opportunities for trade. The medieval merchant faced challenges that would be familiar to modern business people. He had to deal with fluctuating exchange rates, unreliable transportation, and the constant threat of theft or political upheaval. But he also had opportunities that came from the expanding economy and the growing demand for luxury goods. The rise of the middle class created new markets for items that had once been available only to the nobility. The development of banking and credit was crucial to medieval commerce. The Italian banks, like the Medici of Florence and the Fuggers of Augsburg, created financial networks that spanned Europe. They developed sophisticated accounting methods, including double-entry bookkeeping, that allowed them to track complex transactions across multiple currencies and time periods. The letter of credit, which allowed merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, eliminated the need to transport large amounts of cash over dangerous roads. Medieval cities were centers of manufacturing as well as trade. The cloth industry of Flanders, the metalworking of Nuremberg, and the glassmaking of Venice created products that were sought after across Europe. These industries were organized by craft guilds that controlled production, maintained quality standards, and provided training for new workers. The guild system created an urban aristocracy of master craftsmen who often became wealthy and influential citizens. The physical layout of medieval cities reflected their commercial purpose. The market square was typically at the heart of the city, surrounded by the guild halls, the town church, and the houses of wealthy merchants. The streets were narrow and winding, designed for pedestrians rather than vehicles. The upper stories of buildings often jutted out over the street, creating shaded arcades where merchants could display their wares. Urban life in the Middle Ages was vibrant and diverse. The city attracted people from all walks of life, craftsmen seeking apprenticeships, peasants looking for work, scholars traveling to universities, and pilgrims on their way to sacred sites. This diversity created a cosmopolitan atmosphere that was very different from the more homogeneous rural communities. Cities were places where new ideas could flourish, where social mobility was possible, and where the rigid hierarchies of feudal society began to break down. The mystic's vision, spiritual life, and religious experience. In a small cell attached to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, a woman sits in quiet contemplation. The year is 1373, and Julian of Norwich has just experienced a series of visions that will become one of the most profound spiritual texts of the Middle Ages. Through the single window of her anchorage, she can see the altar of the church, where the daily cycle of masses and prayers continues. But her mind is focused on something far beyond the material world, a direct encounter with the divine that will reshape her understanding of God, suffering, and human nature. The spiritual life of medieval Europe was rich and varied, encompassing not just the official theology of the church, but also a wide range of mystical experiences, popular devotions, and religious practices. The Middle Ages produced some of the most profound spiritual writers in Christian history, men and women who explored the depths of religious experience with remarkable psychological insight and literary skill. Medieval mysticism was characterized by its emphasis on direct, personal experience of the divine. Unlike the systematic theology of the universities, mystical writing was often poetic, symbolic, and deeply personal. Mystics like Meister Eckhart, Johannes Tauler, and Heinrich Suso, all members of the Dominican order in Germany, developed a sophisticated understanding of spiritual psychology that emphasized the union of the soul with God. The Beguines, communities of lay women who lived religious lives without taking formal vows, produced some of the most remarkable mystical writings of the period. Mechtild of Magdeburg, who lived in the 13th century, wrote The Flowing Light of the Godhead, a work that combines mystical theology with erotic imagery in ways that anticipate later Spanish mystics like St. John of the Cross. These women, who lived on the margins of official church structure, often experienced persecution for their unconventional spirituality. The devotional practices of medieval Christians were elaborate and deeply symbolic. The liturgical calendar provided a rhythm of feasts and fasts that shaped the entire year. The celebration of Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost involved not just church services, but elaborate processions, mystery plays, and community festivities. The Book of Hours, a prayer book for private devotion, became one of the most popular texts of the later Middle Ages, with beautifully illuminated versions owned by wealthy laypeople. The cult of saints played a central role in medieval spirituality. Each saint had his or her own feast day, special prayers, and particular areas of expertise. Saint Christopher protected travelers, Saint Blaise cured throat ailments, and Saint Barbara watched over artillerymen. The relics of saints, pieces of bone, hair, or clothing, were believed to have miraculous powers and were displayed in elaborate reliquaries made of gold and precious stones. Popular religious practices often blended Christian doctrine with older folk traditions. The celebration of May Day, though officially condemned by the Church, continued in many regions with its ancient associations with fertility and renewal. The lighting of bonfires on St. John's Eve, the blessing of animals on St. Francis's feast day, and the elaborate Christmas traditions that surrounded the winter solstice all reflected a spirituality that was deeply connected to the natural world and the cycle of seasons. The later Middle Ages saw the development of new forms of devotion that emphasized the humanity of Christ and the importance of emotional response to religious truth. The Devotio Moderna, a movement that began in the Low Countries, encouraged Christians to develop a personal relationship with Jesus through meditation, prayer, and the imitation of his life. Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, written in the 15th century, became one of the most widely read books in Christian history. The Scholar's Quest, Learning and Intellectual Life. In the candlelit library of the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, Brother Alcuin bends over a manuscript of Aristotle's Metaphysics, his quill pen moving carefully across the margins as he adds his own commentary to the ancient text. The year is 1250, and he is part of a great intellectual revolution that is transforming European thought. The rediscovery of Aristotelian philosophy, transmitted through Arabic translations and commentaries, is challenging Christian scholars to reconcile reason with faith, philosophy with theology. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed what historians call the Renaissance of the 12th century, a period of intellectual renewal that laid the foundations for the later, more famous Renaissance. This earlier Renaissance was characterized by the recovery of classical texts, the development of new philosophical methods, and the establishment of universities as centers of learning. The translation movement of the 12th century was one of the most important cultural developments of the Middle Ages. Scholars like Gerard of Cremona traveled to Spain to work in the libraries of Toledo and Córdoba, where they translated hundreds of Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and other ancient authors, along with the commentaries of Islamic scholars like Averroes and Avicenna, flooded into European intellectual life. The University of Paris became the center of this intellectual renaissance. In the lecture halls of the School of Notre Dame, masters like Peter Abelard and William of Champeaux engaged in passionate debates about the nature of universal concepts, the relationship between reason and faith, and the proper method of theological inquiry. Abelard's Sic et non, yes and no, presented contradictory passages from Scripture, and the Church Fathers, challenging students to use reason to reconcile apparent contradictions. The development of scholastic method was perhaps the greatest intellectual achievement of the medieval period. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, and John Duns Scotus created sophisticated philosophical systems that addressed fundamental questions about the nature of God, the soul, and the physical world. Their method involved the careful analysis of authoritative texts, the consideration of objections and counter-arguments, and the synthesis of different sources of knowledge. The medieval university was a truly international institution, Students and masters travelled freely between different centres of learning, creating a common intellectual culture that transcended national boundaries. The language of instruction was Latin, which allowed a scholar from Oxford to lecture in Paris or Bologna without difficulty. The curriculum was standardised, with students studying the 7 liberal arts before proceeding to the higher faculties of theology, law, or medicine. The intellectual life of the medieval period was not limited to universities. Cathedral schools, monastery libraries, and the courts of enlightened rulers all served as centres of learning. The court of Frederick II in Sicily, for example, attracted scholars from across Europe and the Islamic world. The translations of Arabic works on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that were produced there had a profound impact on European intellectual development. The rise of vernacular literature in the later Middle Ages reflected the growing literacy of the lay population and the emergence of new forms of intellectual expression. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio created works that combined classical learning with contemporary concerns, addressing audiences that extended beyond the universities and monasteries. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, democratized knowledge and made books available to an ever wider audience. The Craftsman's Workshop, masters of medieval art and technology. In the golden light of an autumn morning in 13th century Cologne, Master Heinrich examines the latest work of his apprentice. The young man has been carefully carving the delicate folds of a stone angel's robes, destined for the great cathedral that has been rising slowly from the city's heart for nearly a decade. The workshop is filled with the sounds of creation, the tap of chisels on stone, the rasp of files on metal, and the gentle scraping of brushes applying pigment to wood and canvas. The medieval craftsman was far more than a simple labourer. He was an artist, an engineer, and a keeper of ancient knowledge passed down through generations of skilled hands. In an age before mass production, every object was individually crafted, imbued with the personality and skill of its maker. The workshops of medieval Europe were centres of innovation and artistry that produced works of such beauty and technical sophistication that they continue to inspire wonder today. The guild system that governed medieval crafts was one of the most sophisticated forms of professional organisation in human history. Each craft had its own guild, from the humble shoemakers to the prestigious goldsmiths. These organizations controlled every aspect of production, from the quality of materials to the training of new craftsmen. The guilds maintained strict standards, regulated prices, and provided support for members who fell ill or encountered hard times. The journey from apprentice to master was a carefully structured process that could take 15 years or more. A boy, usually between the ages of 12 and 14, would be bound to a master craftsman for a period of 7 years. During this time, he would live in the master's house, receiving food, clothing, and basic education in exchange for his labour. The apprentice would begin with the simplest tasks, sweeping the workshop, organising tools, preparing materials, gradually working his way up to more complex work. After completing his apprenticeship, the young craftsman would become a journeyman, free to work for wages but not yet qualified to open his own shop. The term journeyman comes from the French journée, meaning day, as these skilled workers were paid by the day. Many journeymen would travel from city to city, working for different masters and learning new techniques. This tradition of wandering craftsmen spread innovations across Europe and created a remarkable uniformity in technical standards. The final step was achieving the status of master craftsman. This required the creation of a masterpiece, a work that demonstrated complete mastery of the craft. The candidate would present his masterpiece to the guild, which would examine it carefully for technical excellence and artistic merit. If accepted, the new master could open his own workshop, take on apprentices, and participate in guild governance. The medieval workshop was a complex environment where art and technology intertwined. The glazier who created the stained glass windows of a great cathedral needed to understand not just the aesthetic principles of color and light, but also the chemical properties of glass, the techniques of lead soldering, and the engineering principles that would allow his windows to withstand wind and weather for centuries. The great cathedral builders of the medieval period achieved feats of engineering that rival modern construction projects. The master masons who designed buildings like Notre Dame de Paris or Chartres Cathedral understood complex mathematical principles and structural engineering techniques that would not be formally codified until centuries later. They developed sophisticated systems of flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and pointed arches that allowed them to build structures of unprecedented height and delicacy. The medieval metalworker was both artist and scientist. The creation of a sword required not just skill in forging and shaping metal, but also deep knowledge of metallurgy. The master swordsmith understood how different types of steel could be combined to create a blade that was both flexible and hard, how heat treatment could alter the properties of metal, and how the pattern of folding and welding could create the beautiful designs that decorated the finest weapons. The art of illuminated manuscripts represented perhaps the highest achievement of medieval craftsmanship. In the scriptoriums of great monasteries and the workshops of urban artisans, skilled illuminators created books that were treasures of art and learning. The creation of a single illuminated page might involve a dozen different craftsmen: the scribe who wrote the text, the artist who designed the decorations, the specialist who prepared the gold leaf, and the binder who assembled the finished book. The medieval illuminator worked with a palette of colors that would amaze modern artists. The deep blue of lapis lazuli, imported at enormous cost from Afghanistan, was reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary. The brilliant red of cinnabar, the warm yellow of orpiment, and the rich purple of murex shells created a rainbow of hues that seemed to glow from within. The preparation of these pigments was a closely guarded secret, passed down from master to apprentice through generations of artists. The techniques of medieval craftsmen were often surprisingly sophisticated. The process of making parchment from animal skins required precise control of temperature, humidity, and chemical treatment. The creation of chainmail involved the production of thousands of individual rings, each one carefully shaped, hardened, and joined to its neighbors. The construction of a medieval clock required the coordination of gears, springs, and escapement mechanisms that demanded precision engineering. The medieval carpenter was architect, engineer, and artist combined. The great wooden structures of the period, the soaring timber roofs of parish churches, the elaborate screens that separated the choir from the nave, the intricate wooden sculptures that adorned altars and rood screens, required not just technical skill, but also artistic vision. The master carpenter understood the properties of different woods, the techniques of joinery that would create strong and lasting structures, and the principles of design that would make his work both functional and beautiful. The tradition of medieval craftsmanship was not just about creating beautiful objects. It was about preserving and transmitting knowledge. In an age before printed books, the workshop was a living library where techniques, recipes, and innovations were stored in the memories and hands of skilled craftsmen. The master craftsman was a teacher as well as a producer, responsible for passing on not just technical skills, but also the values and traditions that defined his craft. The medieval guild system also provided a form of social security that would not be matched until modern times. Guild members contributed to funds that supported widows and orphans, cared for members who could no longer work, and provided for the burial of deceased craftsmen. The guild hall served as a social center where members gathered for feasts, religious ceremonies, and business meetings. These organizations created a sense of community and mutual support that extended far beyond the workplace. The innovations of medieval craftsmen laid the foundation for many technologies that we still use today. The water wheel, perfected by medieval millers, was one of the first examples of industrial machinery. The mechanical clock, developed in the 14th century, revolutionized the measurement of time and laid the groundwork for precision engineering. The improvements in metallurgy that produced better tools and weapons also led to advances in agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. The medieval period saw the development of new forms of artistic expression that reflected the changing needs and values of society. The rise of secular art in the later Middle Ages, reflected in the decoration of town halls, merchant houses, and private chapels, showed a growing confidence in worldly achievement and individual expression. The development of portraiture, landscape painting, and genre scenes marked a move away from the purely religious art of the early medieval period. The workshop tradition of medieval Europe created a culture of excellence that valued both technical mastery and artistic creativity. The craftsman who spent decades perfecting his skills, who took pride in every detail of his work, and who passed on his knowledge to the next generation embodied values that modern society is still trying to recover. In an age of mass production and disposable goods, the medieval workshop reminds us of the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful, useful, and lasting with our own hands. The healer's garden, medicine, herbs, and the art of healing. In the quiet cloister garden of the Abbey of St. Hildegard in the Rhine Valley, Sister Margareta tends to her medicinal plants with the same care that other nuns might devote to illuminating manuscripts or copying sacred texts. The morning dew still clings to the leaves of chamomile and mint, while the early sunlight catches the silver-green foliage of sage and the delicate purple flowers of lavender. This garden is not merely decorative. It is a living pharmacy, a repository of healing knowledge that has been cultivated and refined over centuries. The medieval approach to medicine was holistic in ways that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. The physician of the Middle Ages understood that health was not simply the absence of disease, but a state of balance between the physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of human existence. This understanding shaped every aspect of medical practice, from the diagnosis of illness to the preparation of remedies. The monastic tradition played a crucial role in preserving and developing medical knowledge. Monasteries served as hospitals, medical schools, and centers of pharmaceutical research. The monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to healing drew upon classical texts, Islamic medical treatises, and centuries of practical experience. They created some of the most comprehensive medical libraries in Europe and maintained gardens where hundreds of medicinal plants were cultivated and studied. The medieval physician's garden was a masterpiece of botanical organization. Plants were arranged not just for aesthetic appeal, but according to their medicinal properties and the seasons in which they were most effective. The garden typically included a section for culinary herbs that aided digestion, another for plants used in treating wounds and infections, and a special area for the more dangerous plants that required careful handling and precise dosing. The knowledge of plant medicine was passed down through generations of healers, each adding their own observations and discoveries to the collective wisdom. The medieval herbalist understood that the same plant might have different effects depending on when it was harvested, how it was prepared, and what other substances it was combined with. This understanding led to the development of complex preparations that combined multiple herbs in carefully balanced proportions. The process of creating medieval medicines was both art and science. The herbalist would gather plants at specific times of day and season. often following lunar cycles and astrological calculations. The preparation might involve drying, grinding, distillation, or fermentation, each process designed to extract and concentrate the active principles of the plant. The final medicine might be a simple tea, a complex tincture, or an elaborate compound that included dozens of ingredients. Many medieval remedies were surprisingly effective. Willow bark, which contains salicin, was used to treat pain and fever centuries before aspirin was synthesized. Digitalis from foxglove was prescribed for heart conditions, while ergot from rye was used to assist in childbirth. The medieval pharmacopoeia included treatments for everything from depression to kidney stones, many of which have been validated by modern scientific research. The medieval understanding of mental health was remarkably sophisticated. Physicians recognized that emotional disturbances could have physical causes and that physical ailments could affect mental well-being. The treatment of melancholia, as depression was known, might include dietary changes, exercise, music therapy, and counseling, along with herbal remedies. The concept of the non-naturals, air, diet, exercise, sleep, emotional state, and elimination, provided a framework for understanding health that emphasized prevention rather than just treatment. The medieval hospital was a revolutionary institution that provided care for all members of society, regardless of their ability to pay. The great hospitals of the period, such as the Hôtel Dieu in Paris or the Hospital of the Holy Spirit in Rome, were complex organizations that provided not just medical care, but also food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. These institutions were supported by donations from wealthy patrons and operated according to strict rules that ensured the best possible care for patients. The role of women in medieval medicine was far more significant than is often recognized. While formal medical education was generally restricted to men, women served as midwives, herbalists, and healers in their communities. The tradition of wise women who possessed extensive knowledge of plant medicine and healing practices was particularly strong in rural areas. These women often provided the primary medical care for their communities, treating everything from common illnesses to serious injuries. The medieval understanding of anatomy was based primarily on the works of Galen, whose theories had been developed through the dissection of animals rather than human corpses. However, by the 13th century, human dissection was beginning to be practiced in medical schools, leading to important discoveries about the structure and function of the human body. The anatomical knowledge of medieval physicians was more sophisticated than is often assumed, and their surgical techniques were often remarkably advanced. The medieval approach to surgery was necessarily different from modern practice, given the absence of anesthesia and antiseptics. However, medieval surgeons developed techniques for controlling bleeding, preventing infection, and managing pain that allowed them to perform complex procedures. The surgical texts of the period describe operations for cataracts, kidney stones, and various forms of trauma, often with detailed instructions for post-operative care. The medieval physician understood the importance of diet in maintaining health and treating disease. The medical theory of the time held that different foods had different qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and that these qualities needed to be balanced according to the patient's constitution and condition. This led to the development of detailed dietary regimens that were tailored to individual patients and their specific needs. The practice of medieval medicine was closely integrated with spiritual and religious beliefs. Illness was often seen as having spiritual as well as physical causes, and treatment might include prayer, pilgrimage, and religious ritual, along with medical remedies. The physician was expected to care for the soul as well as the body, and many medical texts included discussions of spiritual as well as physical healing. The medieval period saw the development of the first medical schools and the establishment of formal medical degrees. The University of Salerno, founded in the 9th century, was the first institution to offer systematic medical education, followed by schools at Montpellier, Paris, and other centers. These institutions created a new class of professional physicians who combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience. The medieval understanding of public health was remarkably advanced. Physicians recognized the importance of clean water, proper sanitation, and the isolation of infectious diseases. Medieval cities developed sophisticated systems for waste disposal, water supply, and the regulation of food quality. The Great Plague outbreaks of the 14th century led to the development of quarantine procedures and public health measures that would influence medical practice for centuries. The legacy of medieval medicine is more significant than is often recognized. The holistic approach to health, the emphasis on prevention, the integration of mental and physical care, and the recognition of the importance of environment and lifestyle in determining health outcomes all anticipate modern developments in medicine. The medieval physician's garden, with its carefully cultivated healing plants, reminds us that the relationship between humanity and nature in the pursuit of health is both ancient and enduring. The artisan's fire, blacksmiths, metalworkers, and the forge. The rhythmic hammering echoes through the narrow streets of a medieval town as Master Willem shapes red-hot iron on his anvil. Sparks fly in brilliant arcs, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls of his workshop. The forge glows like a contained sun, its heat transforming raw metal into tools, weapons, and works of art that will last for centuries. This is the domain of the blacksmith, the medieval craftsman who tamed fire and metal to create the essential implements of medieval life. The medieval blacksmith held a unique position in society. He was both essential tradesman and mysterious figure, someone who could transform formless metal into precisely crafted tools through the application of fire, skill, and secret knowledge. The smithy was a place of transformation, where raw materials became finished products through processes that seemed almost magical to those who did not understand them. The training of a medieval blacksmith was long and demanding. A young apprentice would begin by learning to maintain the fire, understanding the different types of coal and charcoal that burned at different temperatures, and recognizing the subtle color changes that indicated when metal was ready to be worked. The apprentice would spend months just learning to read the fire, to understand how airflow affected combustion, and to maintain the precise temperatures needed for different types of work. The medieval forge was a carefully designed system that maximized efficiency and heat production. The hearth was typically built of stone and clay, with a bellows system that could be operated by hand or, in larger shops, by water power. The bellows were made of leather and wood, carefully crafted to provide a steady stream of air that would maintain the high temperatures needed for metalworking. The design of the forge and the skill of the smith in managing the fire were crucial factors in determining the quality of the finished product. The medieval blacksmith worked with a variety of metals, each with its own properties and uses. Iron was the most common material, relatively abundant and suitable for most tools and implements. Steel, which was iron with a controlled amount of carbon, was more difficult to produce, but created superior tools and weapons. The smith understood the different grades of steel and how to work with each one to achieve the desired properties of hardness, flexibility, and durability. The process of creating a medieval tool or weapon was complex and time-consuming. The smith would begin by heating the metal to the appropriate temperature, judging by color and other visual cues when it was ready to be worked. The heated metal would be shaped using a variety of hammers and tools, each designed for specific purposes. The smith would work quickly while the metal was hot, reheat it as necessary, and gradually shape it into the desired form. The medieval blacksmith was not just a metal worker, but also an engineer and designer. The creation of complex items like suits of armor, elaborate door hinges, or precision tools required careful planning and sophisticated understanding of mechanical principles. The smith had to understand how different parts would fit together, how stress would be distributed, and how to create joints and connections that would remain strong under use. The specialization within the metalworking trades was extensive. While the village blacksmith might create a wide variety of items, urban craftsmen often specialized in particular types of work. The armorers who created the elaborate suits of plate armor worn by medieval knights were highly skilled specialists who understood both metallurgy and human anatomy. The creation of a suit of armor required precise measurements, careful shaping of each piece, and the development of joint systems that would allow the wearer to move freely while providing maximum protection. The medieval weaponsmith was perhaps the most skilled of all metalworkers. The creation of a sword required not just technical expertise, but also artistic vision. The best medieval swords were not just weapons, but works of art, with elaborate crossguards, decorated pommels, and blade patterns that reflected the skill and creativity of their makers. The process of creating a medieval sword might take weeks or months, with each step requiring precise timing and perfect technique. The techniques used by medieval metalworkers were often surprisingly sophisticated. The process of pattern welding, used to create the distinctive patterns on early medieval swords, involved the careful folding and welding of different types of steel to create blades that were both beautiful and functional. The development of the blast furnace in the later medieval period allowed for the production of cast iron and more efficient steel production, revolutionizing the metalworking industry. The medieval blacksmith also played a crucial role in agricultural development. The iron plowshare, horseshoe, and various agricultural tools created by medieval smiths made possible the agricultural innovations that supported the growth of medieval civilization. The development of better tools led to increased agricultural productivity, which in turn supported larger populations and more complex societies. The guild system that governed medieval crafts was particularly important for metalworkers. The smiths' guilds controlled the quality of materials, regulated the training of apprentices, and maintained the standards that ensured customers received high-quality products. The guilds also provided social support for their members and maintained the traditions and techniques that were passed down from generation to generation. The medieval metalworker was also an innovator who continuously developed new techniques and improved existing ones. The development of the trip hammer, powered by water wheels, allowed for the production of larger and more complex items. The improvement of furnace design and the development of new alloys expanded the range of possible products. The medieval period saw continuous innovation in metalworking techniques that laid the foundation for later industrial development. The working conditions in a medieval smithy were harsh by modern standards. The intense heat, the physical demands of hammering hot metal, and the constant exposure to smoke and sparks made blacksmithing a demanding profession. However, the smith's skill and the essential nature of his work ensured that he was well compensated and highly respected in his community. The products of medieval metalworkers were built to last. The tools, weapons, and implements created by medieval smiths were designed for durability and functionality rather than planned obsolescence. Many examples of medieval metalwork survive today, testament to the skill and craftsmanship of their creators. The medieval blacksmith's understanding of materials, his mastery of fire and hammer, and his commitment to quality created objects that continue to inspire admiration centuries after their creation. The legacy of medieval metalworking extends far beyond the objects themselves. The techniques developed by medieval smiths, the understanding of metallurgy that they accumulated, and the traditions of craftsmanship that they maintained all contributed to the later development of industry and technology. The medieval smithy, with its glowing forge and skilled craftsmen, represents a crucial link in the chain of human technological development, a reminder of the importance of skilled craftsmanship in creating the tools and implements that shape our world. The evening bell, daily rhythms, and the cycle of medieval life. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the medieval countryside, the bells of the village church begin their evening call. The sound carries across the fields where peasants are gathering their tools after a day of labor, over the walls of the castle where knights are returning from their training, and through the narrow streets of the town where merchants are closing their shops for the night. This is the rhythm that governed medieval life, a cycle as old as humanity itself, yet shaped by the unique circumstances of the Middle Ages. The medieval day was structured around the canonical hours, the 8 prayer times that divided the day from dawn to dusk. These hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, were not just religious observances, but the fundamental organizing principle of medieval society. They determined when work began and ended, when meals were taken, and when communities gathered for prayer and reflection. In the quiet hours before dawn, the monastery bell would ring for matins, calling the monks to their first prayer of the day. The sound would drift across the sleeping village, a gentle reminder that the new day was beginning. Soon, the first threads of light would appear in the eastern sky, and the world would slowly come to life. The baker would kindle his ovens, the stable boy would tend to the horses, and the farm labourers would begin their trek to the fields. The medieval understanding of time was fundamentally different from our modern conception. Without clocks as we know them, time was measured by the movement of the sun, the changing seasons, and the rhythm of agricultural work. The day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, but these hours varied in length depending on the season. A summer hour was longer than a winter hour, and the medieval person lived in harmony with these natural variations. The agricultural calendar shaped every aspect of medieval life. Spring brought the excitement of planting, as communities worked together to prepare the fields and sow the crops that would sustain them through the year. Summer was a time of constant vigilance, tending the growing plants, protecting them from pests and disease, and praying for the right balance of sun and rain. Autumn brought the harvest, perhaps the most important time of the medieval year, when the entire community would work together to gather the fruits of their labor. Winter was a time of rest and reflection, when the shortened days and cold weather forced people to spend more time indoors. This was when the great stories were told, when families gathered around the fire to share tales that had been passed down through generations. The long winter evenings were filled with the quiet activities that sustained medieval culture: the spinning of wool, the mending of tools, the crafting of household items, and the teaching of children. The medieval household was a complex organization that included not just the nuclear family, but also servants, apprentices, and extended relatives. The daily routine of the household was carefully choreographed, with everyone having specific roles and responsibilities. The morning would begin with prayers and the breaking of the fast, followed by the division of labor according to season and need. The mistress of the house would oversee the domestic work, ensuring that meals were prepared, clothes were cleaned and mended, and the household ran smoothly. The medieval meal was both a practical necessity and a social ritual. The main meal of the day was typically taken in the late morning or early afternoon, when the work of the morning was complete, but there was still time for the afternoon's labor. The food was simple but nourishing, based on the products of the local area and the season. Bread was the staple food, accompanied by ale or wine, vegetables from the garden, and meat when available. The evening meal was lighter, often consisting of bread, cheese, and ale. But the true importance of the evening meal was social rather than nutritional. This was when the family gathered to share news of the day, when stories were told, and when the bonds of community were strengthened. The sharing of food was a sacred act that created obligations and relationships that extended far beyond the dinner table. The medieval understanding of community was based on mutual obligation and shared responsibility. The village was not just a collection of individual households, but an organic whole in which each person had a role to play. The farmer depended on the miller to grind his grain. The miller depended on the baker to turn flour into bread, and the baker depended on the farmer to provide the grain. This web of interdependence created a sense of community that was both practical and spiritual. The festivals and celebrations of the medieval year provided breaks in the routine of daily life and opportunities for the community to come together. Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were the great feasts of the Christian year, celebrated with special foods, elaborate church services, and community festivities. But there were also secular celebrations, harvest festivals, May Day celebrations, and the various saints' days that marked the passage of time. The medieval person lived in intimate contact with the natural world in ways that modern people can hardly imagine. The changing seasons were not just abstract concepts, but lived realities that affected every aspect of daily life. The position of the sun determined when work began and ended. The phases of the moon influenced agricultural activities, and the weather was a constant concern that could mean the difference between prosperity and famine. The sounds of medieval life were very different from those of the modern world. Instead of the constant hum of machinery and traffic, the medieval soundscape was dominated by natural sounds, the lowing of cattle, the barking of dogs, the creaking of cartwheels, and the voices of people going about their daily tasks. The bell tower was the center of the medieval sound world, its bronze voice calling the community to prayer, announcing the time of day and warning of danger. The medieval night was a time of mystery and wonder. Without electric lights, the darkness was profound and complete, broken only by the flickering light of candles, oil lamps, and the occasional fire. The night sky was brilliant with stars, unmarred by light pollution, and the medieval person lived in intimate contact with the celestial rhythms that governed the passage of time. The phases of the moon, the movement of the planets, and the seasonal changes in the constellations were all familiar parts of the medieval person's experience. As the evening bell rings and the day draws to a close, the medieval world prepares for sleep. The farmer banks his fire and checks on his animals one last time. The craftsman puts away his tools and offers a prayer of thanks for the day's work. The merchant counts his earnings and plans for tomorrow's activities. The scholar closes his books and contemplates the knowledge he has gained. The monk prepares for the night prayers that will divide his sleep into periods of rest and worship. The medieval bed was a precious possession, often the most valuable item in a household. The wealthy slept on feather mattresses, covered with fine linen and wool blankets, while the poor made do with straw pallets and coarse woolen covers. But rich or poor, the medieval person understood that sleep was a gift from God, a time of rest and renewal that prepared the body and soul for the challenges of the coming day. The eternal cycle, legacy, and continuity in medieval life. And so the medieval day ends as it began, with the sound of bells and the rhythm of prayer. But this ending is also a beginning, for tomorrow will bring the same cycle of work and rest, prayer and labor, community and solitude that has shaped human life for countless generations. The medieval world was not a static place frozen in time, but a living, breathing society that adapted and changed while maintaining its essential character. The legacy of the Middle Ages is all around us, woven into the fabric of modern life in ways both obvious and subtle. The universities where we study, the hospitals where we heal, the cities where we live, and the democratic institutions that govern us all have their roots in medieval innovations. The great cathedrals still soar above European cities, their stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, but their essential structure unchanged. The manuscripts carefully copied by medieval monks preserve the wisdom of the ancient world and the insights of medieval thinkers. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Middle Ages is less tangible. The understanding that human life is part of a larger pattern, that we are connected to those who came before us and those who will come after. The medieval person lived with a sense of continuity and purpose that modern life often lacks. They understood that their daily work was part of a larger whole, that their individual lives had meaning within the context of family, community, and faith. The medieval craftsman who spent decades perfecting his skill, the scholar who devoted his life to preserving and transmitting knowledge, the farmer who worked the same land as his ancestors, all of these people understood that they were part of a story that was larger than themselves. They lived with the knowledge that their work would outlast their lives, that the objects they created, the children they raised, and the communities they helped to build would continue long after they were gone. The medieval understanding of time was circular rather than linear. The day returned to night, the seasons followed their eternal cycle, and the years turned like the pages of a great book whose story never truly ended. This cyclical view of time gave medieval people a sense of stability and continuity that helped them endure hardship and find meaning in suffering. They understood that every ending was also a beginning, that every death was followed by new life, and that every winter was followed by spring. The medieval world was not perfect. It was marked by violence, disease, and hardship that would be unacceptable to modern sensibilities. But it was also a world of beauty, meaning, and community that modern life often lacks. The medieval person lived in a world where every activity had significance, where work was more than just a means of earning money, and where the individual was part of a larger spiritual and social order. As we contemplate the hidden history of the Middle Ages, we are reminded that the past is not truly past, but continues to live in the present. The medieval world lives on in the buildings we inhabit, the institutions we rely on, and the values we hold dear. The craftsman's dedication to quality, the scholar's pursuit of knowledge, the healer's compassion for suffering, and the farmer's connection to the land all speak to enduring human values that transcend the boundaries of time and place. The evening bell that called medieval people to prayer continues to ring in our modern world, though we may not always hear it. It calls us to remember that we are part of a larger story, that our lives have meaning and purpose, and that we are connected to all those who have come before us and all those who will come after. In the gentle rhythm of the medieval day, in the cycle of work and rest, prayer and labor, we find a pattern that can still guide us in our modern lives. And so, as we close this journey through the hidden history of the Middle Ages, we are reminded that the past is not a foreign country, but our own heritage, not a time of darkness, but an age of light and learning, not a period of stagnation, but an era of growth and change. The medieval world speaks to us across the centuries, reminding us of truths about human nature and community that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The bell tower grows silent, the last light fades from the western sky, and the medieval world settles into peaceful sleep. But the story continues, for every ending is also a beginning, and every sleep is followed by awakening. The hidden history of the Middle Ages is not just a record of the past, but a guide for the future, a reminder that we are all part of the great human story that began in the mists of time and will continue long after we are gone. Rest well, traveller, for tomorrow brings new journeys and new discoveries. The medieval world awaits your return, patient and eternal, ready to share its secrets with all who approach with open hearts and curious minds. In the gentle rhythm of the medieval day, in the cycle of seasons and the turning of years, we find the peace that comes from knowing our place in the great story of human existence. Sleep now and dream of the hidden history that surrounds us all.